Hello and welcome to Generation 16, a series that showcases the history of Sega's Mega Drive. I'm your host, Greg Stewart. Considering the mini console craze seems to be well past its prime at this point, Sega deciding on a Mega Drive Mini 2 release at all is a bit surprising, let alone releasing localized versions for North America and the UK and Europe. What's not surprising is the relatively low production run and the weird hoops some of us had to jump through to get our hardware. Here in Canada, I wasn't even sure I'd be able to order one directly until a couple of weeks before launch. Still, I love that Sega chose to do this. The Genesis library is so much deeper than the usual suspects that have been re-released to death, so any opportunity to dig down below that surface and help people discover some hidden gems is really nice to see. Plus, I love that the Mega Drive Mini 2 release gives us a chance to have a miniaturized version of the updated design. Most of my nostalgia surrounding the Genesis is with the original model and the Tower of Power, but some of the system's best years were while the second design was on the market. Speaking of the Tower of Power, Sega of Japan again chose to release a non-functional Mega CD add-on for the new mini console, this time alongside a miniature copy of Sonic CD and a Virtua Racing cartridge. Even more delightful is the inclusion of the deck expansion in order to house the slightly bigger Mega Drive Mini. This is how I saw so many Genesis and Sega CD combos back in the day, as well as the extra cuff needed to pop the 32X Mini into the cartridge slot. This whole thing shows a real love for the source material that can't help but make an old Genesis fan smile. So what about the console itself? Much like the original redesign, this new console definitely feels like it's all about cost saving. The North American Genesis Mini 2 is not a faithful replica of the original Genesis 2, but rather a repaint of the Mega Drive Mini 2 that still features the power slider and no power light. But whatever, it's close enough. It also comes with a 6-button controller this time around, thank goodness. At least Street Fighter 2 is actually playable. This time the mode button on the controller actually functions as a reset button too, which is a really nice touch. The interface feels similar to the previous mini console, with a selection of game box thumbnails that can be reorganized based on release date, alphabetically, by media type, genre, etc., as well as changing to a spine-only view. All this is done with another original composition by Yuzo Koshiro, which pays homage to many of the soundtracks from the games on the system, accompanying the menu navigation. Now I need to stop for a moment and nerd out about the fact that the Genesis Mini 2 is a celebration of the Sega CD, which is one of my favorite consoles of all time. While it's generally looked at nowadays as the tipping point where Sega began to chip away at the consumer goodwill it had built with the Genesis, basically the beginning of the end, I love that Sega has chosen to celebrate it here. The selection of games, especially on the North American side, doesn't go quite far enough in my opinion, but we'll get into that later. Another great feature that needs to be called out is the audio selection. Back in the 90s, as the Mega Drive aged, it was revised to be more cost-effective, which included changing up the sound chip. I won't get into deep detail here because, honestly, I'm not qualified to do so, but suffice it to say that the Model 1 and Model 2 Genesis consoles have a different sound. Luckily, the Genesis Mini 2 lets you choose which version you'd like to emulate, along with a short music clip to demonstrate the differences between the two sounds. Very cool. The Genesis Mini 2 features over 60 games, which is 50% more than its predecessor. But before we get into my ranking, let's talk about some of the games that didn't make the cut between the Japanese and North American versions. There are a ton of strategy and RPG games on this thing that didn't make the cut due to no official translations, not to mention likely anime licensing rights. It's a real shame stuff like Captain Tsubasa, Dodge Denpei, and Shin Megami Tensei don't have official translations, as I think it would be pretty cool to finally experience them. Not to mention the Party Quiz Mega Q game, which has always been something I'd love to play, but now even more since Sega decided to create an updated version for 2022. However, there are a lot of games here that absolutely could have made the cut. Columns 3, Romance of the Three Kingdoms 3, and Starblade were all released in North America previously. Romance on the Mega CD doesn't have a translation, but the cartridge version is on the Mini 2 as well. I think Magical Taruruto-kun, Mega Panel, and Wonder Mega Collection all could have made the cut as well. None of them are hard to figure out, plus Wonder Mega Collection comes with a version of Flicky that features a Red Book audio soundtrack. But the real tragedy here is that Pop Full Mail and the two Lunar games have been stranded on the Japanese Mega Drive Mini 2. Of course, all three of these games received full English releases back in the day. Unfortunately, Sega didn't seem to be able to come to an agreement with Victor Ireland, former head of working designs and holder of the rights to those original translations. Details are scarce, but it sounds like Sega didn't offer enough money. There have been third-hand accounts that said Ireland wanted royalties, and Sega wasn't willing to do that. Considering the Mega Drive and Genesis Mini 2 are a very limited release, I feel like royalties would have been kinda slim anyway. Either way, it's a real shame. These are three of the most fondly remembered games on the system. Lunar in particular is one of the best-selling Sega CD games, second only to Sonic CD by most accounts. I don't know if it's a result of Sega being cheap or Victor asking for too much money, but at the end of the day it sounds like greed by one or both parties denied North American Genesis 2 owners the chance to replay these fabulous games. Okay, that's out of the way. Let's get on to the list. It's time to rank all of the games on the Genesis Mini 2. Who even wanted Clay Fighter? Nobody. This awful port of an already mediocre Super Nintendo game, which was only ever notable for the claymation characters, is almost offensively bad, especially considering it replaces some of the games I just finished talking about. I hate to be too negative, but this previously unreleased puzzle game should have stayed unreleased. The idea of balancing falling stars on a scale sounds way more interesting than it actually is. You'll never get to the point where the game feels intuitive. It's cool as an oddity, but I seriously doubt I'll ever put any more time into this one.
Populous is an important game in Genesis history. It represents the moment Electronic Arts began publishing for the system, so I understand why it belongs on the Mini 2, but this is not the ideal way to play this granddaddy of God games. The frame rate is really rough, and manipulating the world with a controller rather than a mouse is super clunky. On one hand, it's nice to have Sonic 3D Blast for the sake of having a mostly complete set of Sonic games between the two Genesis mini consoles. Sorry, Sonic 3 and Knuckles. But this game is just not good. Wrestling with the controller while Sonic skates around is so not fun at all. Every time I play the Ooze, I feel like I'm missing something. It's so weird and unique, playing a sentient puddle of ooze. It's very Sega, but it's just not a compelling game. This was the last Genesis game to come out of Sega Technical Institute. In fact, the last game it would solely develop. The game's late 1995 release date doomed it to be an oddity. The terrible audio doesn't help either.
This previously unreleased game is a weird one. At first it kinda looks like a vertical two-player Pong, though each paddle is meant to deflect either angels or devils, depending on which end of the screen they're on. It's interesting in two-player mode, but next to unplayable as a single-player game, since you have to control both paddles simultaneously.
I don't have a lot of experience with the original arcade version of Outrunners, but if it's anything like this Genesis port, I'm not a fan. Outrunners is clearly meant to be played by two players as you're stuck in split screen the whole time, but it doesn't come close to delivering the fun or the charm of the original game. I moan a lot about Sega's weird need to do pre-rendered sprites on everything in the wake of Donkey Kong Country, and while Vector Man was meant to take advantage of exactly that, I will say that I think the character's composition actually fits the style nicely. The game itself, and this sequel, were just never all that interesting. For the longest time, this game was a holy grail for Genesis owners. The almighty treasure has got all its skills on display here, but I'm just gonna say it, I always found this game way too hard to be any kind of fun. Although I count the original game amongst my all-time favorites, Earthworm Jim 2 just never did anything for me. It should have. It's extremely creative with varied, crazy game mechanics and some amazing graphics and animation, but in my opinion, none of it comes together to make a fun, cohesive experience. All in all, a pretty good port of Fatal Fury 2 with decent animation, good control, and some pretty impressive graphics considering the downgrade from the Neo Geo to the Genesis. Not my favorite fighting series, since I never really dug the dual-plane 3D aspect, but still a decent time to be had. Mansion of Hidden Souls is a bit of a head-scratcher. I love that the Genesis Mini 2 is meant to celebrate the Sega CD and all, but Mansion of Hidden Souls isn't really putting its best foot forward. Sure, full-motion video games are a huge part of the system's history, but not this particular full-motion video game. Night Striker is a nice addition, if only giving North American players a look at a Mega CD game previously trapped in Japan. This into-the-screen 3D shooter looks kinda like a Space Harrier clone, and is a bit of a technical accomplishment when you see how closely this home conversion resembles the arcade original. But it loses something in the translation, perhaps due to the lack of a flight stick, which is how it was played in the arcade. Viewpoint is a pretty impressive port of the original isometric Neo Geo shooter, but it's very easy to tell the Genesis hardware is just barely hanging on here. There is loads of slowdown that really impacts the overall experience. Once you get past the technical accomplishment of the game being on the old Genesis hardware, it's not all that much fun.
I can't wrap my head around this old Sega arcade game from 1982. There's a lot going on in Super Locomotive, and it's definitely a unique concept, but there's so much to pay attention to. Upcoming junctions on one half of the screen, pursuing baddies and attacking planes and missiles on the other. It just never clicked with me.
Another previously trapped in Japan Mega CD game on the Genesis Mini 2. This Taito arcade port features a fantastic soundtrack from house band Zuntata, along with middling multiplayer action where you and a friend can strut from left to right, throwing stars and swinging swords at an endless parade of enemies. The action does get intense every now and then, but feels a bit plodding for the most part. Panic on Funkotron is a tough one to place. On the one hand, this is a very decent multiplayer platformer with nice graphics and music and almost as much funky personality as its predecessor. On the other hand, it feels very generic in the wake of a first installment that brilliantly introduced roguelikes to the console-playing MTV generation. While most Western gamers were likely introduced to the strategy RPG via Shining Force or Final Fantasy Tactics, Traco decided to translate and release the very first Langrisser game as Warsong way back in 1991. Warsong definitely shows its age, as it doesn't look as refined as the Shining Force series, and the interface definitely has the feel of an old PC game. The action here is more strategic than the streamlined Shining Force, which can be a good or bad thing depending on what you're looking for. It's a very cool addition to the Genesis Mini 2 though, even if you're playing it simply to get a feel for what preceded Sega's strategy RPG franchise on the console. This was a shooter that I was always interested in when I was a kid, but never had the guts to rent for some reason. I'd heard it was really difficult and was afraid I'd be stuck in the early stages of the game. Years later I tried it and found out I was right, but this is still a really fun shooter. The gimmick is that you need to adjust your firing style to deal with different in-game situations and bosses with specific weak points. Very cool.
I'm not personally a Puyo Puyo fan, but they are really good games, so it's nice to see a brand new port of Sun find its way onto the Genesis Mini 2. You'll definitely get more out of this one if you have a second controller. Luckily, the Genesis 2 is compatible with third-party USB and Bluetooth controllers with the right receivers.
The first of a series of pretty difficult helicopter simulations that was a bit dry, but it was really unique, contemporary, and felt like it straddled the line between PC-style simulator and console shooter really nicely. I like how you couldn't just shoot willy-nilly all over the place as you risked blowing up badly needed resources. This oddball shooter has a dedicated following, so my ranking might seem a bit low because I'm not necessarily part of that crowd. Honestly though, I do see the draw. This feels like a thinking man's gauntlet. A deliberate overhead shooter where you choose which of your allies' abilities best serve each level, then either try to get them to the exit or destroy all enemies. Along the way you can pick up new allies, but you must leave the level exit to keep them. Otherwise, they'll be lost. What a weird and fun concept for an arcade game.
Considering Space Harrier 2 was one of the original launch games in 1988, the prospect of a new port of Space Harrier 1 and 2 on the Genesis Mini 2 was very exciting. Unfortunately, while the frame rate and sprite scaling is great, the flickering is out of control. Apparently there's a hidden option that fixes this somewhat, but still a bit disappointing.
The over-the-top goriness of Splatterhouse was always its main selling point, so it was exciting to see the sequel find its way to the Genesis after previously being locked to the TurboGrafx 16. Nothing about Splatterhouse really stands out otherwise, but that's okay. This is a solid brawler with decent graphics and a great hook that's totally worth busting out every October when you're jonesing for Halloween-themed games. Rolling Thunder 2 is a nice addition. The Genesis port of this Namco arcade game came to the home console pretty much intact, adding in some extra levels, bosses, and weapons, while retaining the two-player mode and, unique for the time, cover mechanic. There's nothing super special about Bonanza Brothers, but the co-op gameplay is nice, and the premise is at least relatively unique. You're not meant to shoot everything here, but rather sneak your way around each level as much as possible to pick up the designated loot and escape. I think the Genesis version was given a new story so that the brothers weren't just simple thieves.
Do you like Fantasy Zone? This is a great version of Fantasy Zone. This early example of a cute-em-up has always been a staple of Sega's classic library, so it's great to see this brand new port find a home on the Genesis Mini 2.
The CD versions of both Echo games feature some of the most gorgeous music to ever grace the console, so it's wonderful that they're both here. Fun fact, Echo 1 and 2 both appeared as a single set when they were released in Japan, which is why these games only take up one slot on the Mega Drive 2. While, objectively, Tides of Time is probably a better game than the original, what with its improved graphics and 3D open ocean bits, I still prefer the first Echo. Echo was such a trailblazing game at the time. Who would have ever thought a sci-fi adventure game where you play as a dolphin would be so good? The CD version of this classic cartridge brought with it a gorgeous soundtrack and some new levels, including a library where you could get some quick National Geographic-style lessons about bottle-decked dolphins. Great stuff. A pretty great sequel that improves on the original, though I still prefer the OG to this. Still, it's a solid hack-and-slash side-scroller with an improved magic system that makes it easier to use smaller spells throughout each level while still saving up for a big attack during boss fights. Nothing to complain about here. Anyone who was gaming back in 1989 will recognize Truxton is that game where the gigantic skull flashes on the screen. You saw it pretty frequently in Genesis ads, since this Toplan shooter was one of the earliest releases on the system in North America. Other than the giant skull, nothing else about the game really stands out, other than it's just a really solid vertical shooter. The first time you fire up Midnight Resistance, you expect this Data East arcade port to play like Contra. And in a lot of ways it does, but with an automatic fire setting and the ability to lock your aim in one of 8 directions while moving independently gives this game a flavor all its own. Even though it's a third-party arcade port, it feels uniquely Genesis, and it's definitely worth playing. I'd never really played this interesting shooter from Technosoft until I covered it for Generation 16, but I'm sure glad I did. This isn't quite on the same level as a bona fide classic like Thunder Force 3 or Gaiares, but it's a very unique vertical shooter that features the ability to charge your weapons and shoot either in front or behind. Plus, it's got a cool fantasy science fiction storyline with some lengthy opening and ending cutscenes. Nice to see some shooters that don't necessarily fall into the spaceship genre. Granada is an overhead, free-roaming tank shooter from Wolf Team featuring some intense action, interesting stages, and huge bosses. Some very cool mechanics at work here too, including bosses that require you to deflect your projectiles off the environment in order to do damage. A true classic on the Genesis, the best early port of a superscalar game with some good design concessions to make up for the lack of a flight stick can trigger. Also, the first Genesis game to feature analog controls using a special controller, but you can't take advantage of that here. This late-stage Genesis game always felt like a showpiece. There's always so much action on screen, big explosions, and gigantic bosses. The control is interesting too, since the sled on the screen moves separately from your awesome robot. Ranger X plays best with a 6-button controller, so it's nice to see they included one this time out.
We may have lost our chance at Flicky on the Genesis Mini 2, but Spatter is a nice consolation prize. Designed by Flicky creator Yoshiki Kawasaki, you can definitely tell this charming little arcade game is cut from the same cloth. Gameplay is really simple. You ride your tricycle around collecting flowers and jumping or bouncing off fences to avoid enemies. It's deceptively shallow at first, but a lot of fun once you get into it.
You can't say you're celebrating the Sega CD without including Night Trap. While it's reasonable to debate whether this is a good game, I personally love it, there's no arguing its importance both to the history of the hardware and the video game industry at large. This campy B-movie sleepover horror game was the poster child for everything alarmed adults felt was wrong with video games in 1993. Sega had a habit of not only porting its arcade games over to the Genesis, but in many cases making them so much more than just a carbon copy. Super Hang-On was the first instance of this. While we got a really solid version of the arcade game, we also got a full-on career mode where players could buy new parts to improve their racing bikes as they moved on to bigger and faster races. Super Monaco GP would see a similar upgrade when it came to the Genesis a year later. Streets of Rage 2 is my favorite game of all time, but Streets of Rage 3 just never did it for me. It's a good game, and from a gameplay perspective, probably better than its predecessor, but the increased difficulty and worse soundtrack really turned me off. Having the better balanced Japanese version on the Genesis Mini 2 is definitely nice though. Based on the Data East arcade game Chelnov, which originally starred a Russian farmer who had been exposed to radiation, the story was changed to be more sensitive to the then recent Chernobyl nuclear incident. I'd never played this game before the Genesis 2, but now that I have, I'm really glad it's on here. What a totally unique shooter. It doesn't look like much nowadays, but this Genesis port of Sega's first fully 3D racer was damn impressive back in the day. And even with the downgrade to the 16-bit console, it managed to retain enough of the look and feel of the original to be loads of fun. I think it still holds up pretty well even today, though I'd prefer to play the 32X version. Herzog 2 is a bona fide classic that seemed like it was sold as a straight shooter back in the day. It's so much more though. An overhead shooter, real-time strategy hybrid that is pretty unique on consoles even 30 years later. Not everyone's cup of tea, but a masterpiece nonetheless. What's this grind fest doing so high on the list? I played through Phantasy Star 2 using an easy mode ROM hack a while back, and let me tell you, when the Meseta and experience points are rebalanced, this is a fantastic JRPG. The first role-playing game on the system might look a bit dated, but the cool sci-fi setting and great battle animations really stand the test of time. I'm so glad this is coming to the Genesis Mini 2. It's such a shame that this awesome game didn't come here back when it was first released. Rainbow Islands is so charming and addictive, and once you discover the hidden depth of the game, you might just be hooked. Outrun is an all-time great, and while it's easy nowadays to play an arcade-perfect or even more than perfect port on a lot of different home consoles, I'm glad the Genesis version made it onto the Mini too. For years, this was the only way I was able to enjoy this classic. The Genesis port captures the feel of the game almost perfectly in my opinion.
Another super rare game that will finally be available to the mass public. The resemblance to A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo feels like a bit more than just an homage, but the gameplay is very unique, combining overhead hack and slash with collecting animal friends that give your protagonist different abilities.
I've always kind of thought that Ristar was based on an early concept for what became Sonic the Hedgehog. At one point, that game was going to star a rabbit that manipulated things with his ears, much like Ristar does with his hands. That may not be the case, but it's the first thing I think of when I play this excellent platformer. So charming. Thunder Force 4 carries on the series' tradition of being some of the strongest shooters on the Mega Drive. This amazing follow-up to the mighty Thunder Force 3 almost feels a touch too intense for the system to handle, but the Genesis manages somehow. Just an incredible game with gorgeous graphics, amazing action, and the standard awesome soundtrack. A worthy swan song for the shooter series that spanned the life of the system. Shining Force CD is a really nice addition to this collection, since it's kind of an obscure late release on the system. This is a 16-bit remake of the first two Shining Force Gaiden games on the Game Gear, as well as a couple of original scenarios that you won't find anywhere else. It doesn't feel quite as polished as Shining Force 2, but it does feature some really nice Red Book audio and a lengthy quest to dig into. By far my favorite 16-bit conversion of Street Fighter II. You have to look past the terrible voice samples and just enjoy playing this wonderful port with a controller that was tailor-made for the game. My roommates and I used to spend hours in the awesome tournament mode on Super Street Fighter II. I'm so happy to see that we have a full collection of 16-bit Shining Force games between the two Genesis mini consoles. With the rise of games like Fire Emblem in the West, it's so cool to remember that Sega might not have been first, but it was the first console manufacturer to really support a AAA strategy RPG series outside of Japan. Not as good as Sonic 2? That's debatable in my opinion, but no matter which side of that argument you take, it's hard to deny that Sonic CD is a really good time. It feels like a spin-off of the first game with a wholly unique time travel element that actually serves a neat story purpose. Plus, Amy. Yeah, I put Sewer Shark above Sonic CD. Night Trap is an important full-motion video game, but Sewer Shark is my favorite on the system. It's cheesy, it's gritty, it's hilariously overacted, and it was plastered all over the system's marketing at launch. I never get tired of Sewer Shark. Back when it was first released, Sylphied was absolutely breathtaking. We were right on the edge of switching to mostly 3D games with the coming of the Saturn, PlayStation, and N64, so Sylphied hit at exactly the right time. Most of us didn't know this into-the-screen shooter was actually a remake of one of Game Art's first games. We also didn't necessarily know that the backgrounds were a form of full-motion video, though even knowing that now is amazing just how crisp everything looks. And the best part is, Sylphied is a fun shooter to boot. Dungeon crawlers aren't normally my thing, but I couldn't get enough of Shining in the Darkness. Gorgeous character designs that really shine through on screen mixed with a bevy of nice touches like characters reacting to menu pop-ups and a cold open added a layer of polish that makes this game really hard to put down. Definitely tough, but worth the ride. The closest thing to an arcade-perfect port of Capcom's all-conquering brawler that you could get back in the day, in some ways Final Fight CD is even better than the original. All 3 selectable characters, 2-player simultaneous action, and a Red Book soundtrack that really delivers put the creaky old Super Nintendo version to shame. I love Robo Alesta. I like it more than Musha. Compile really leaned hard into ancient Japanese imagery and giant robots, and it just works. Now I understand how Nobunaga Oda won the war to unify Japan. Great shooting action, some gigantic bosses, and a kick-ass soundtrack. Genesis owners were spoiled with Shinobi games. Shadow Dancer is a port, really a reimagining of the arcade sequel to the original Shinobi. It plays very similarly to the first game, but has so much more style and atmosphere. Being able to use the dog Yamato to incapacitate enemies while Joe approaches for the final blow is an awesome mechanic too. Great graphics, great soundtrack, great game. One of the earliest Genesis games is still one of the all-time greats. The Revenge of Shinobi managed to maintain the spirit of the arcade original while feeling wholly unique. It's amazing how much it stood the test of time, especially that classic Yuzo Koshiro soundtrack.
All in all, I'm pretty happy with the Genesis Mini 2. It's ridiculous the Popful Mail and the Lunars didn't make it on here, and not every game on the list is a winner, but we've still got a really great collection here that doesn't retread a load of titles that have already been re-released to death, and that represents a decent cross-section of the genres on the system. And that'll do it for this episode of Generation 16. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please like, share, and subscribe, and please consider supporting the show on Patreon. Join me next time when I take a look at I Will, the story of London for the Pioneer Laseractive Mega LD system. See you then.